Hello and welcome back. Today in Chapter 6 we're going to deal with teams. You know, a project manager is only good as his or her team. Getting the right project team is very important, but more importantly, getting that project team to come together cohesively and to form as a project team and to work together as a project team is probably one of the most important things that a project manager can do. And so today we're going to talk all about team development. We're going to talk about conflict and negotiation and the stages of team development. We're going to talk about why conflict can be good and some team building things that a project manager can do. Remember, if the project manager is really not a good leader, as we talked about in a previous chapter, and is not leading his or her team, and the team is not performing, well then the project will never come to fruition. So today video lecture promises to be a little bit shorter. There's not as many concepts, although with that being said, those concepts are just as important. As a matter of fact, it's probably some of the most important concepts that we're going to talk about all semester. At the end of the video, as usual, there were 4 discussion questions. Please make sure that you give me a couple of page write-ups, 2 to 3 pages write-up total and the discussion questions, and turn them in to me on Monday. So without further ado, and until Monday, let's get started with Chapter 6 and team development. So let's get started with project team building, conflict, and negotiation. Here's some steps in building a team. The first thing you've got to do, and we've talked about this in previous chapters, and we've talked about this when we're together in class. The first thing you've got to do is identify skills you need. So if you've got to take a look at what is the project, what are some of the skills I'm going to need in this project? Who am I going to need? What functional excellences am I going to need? Am I going to need finance? Am I going to need accounting, production, maybe customer service, maybe even bringing in a customer or a supplier into the fold as we gather our project team. Then once you understand the skills required, then you've got to go out and identify the personnel in order to fill those skills. Now, a project manager is going to go look for probably the most productive, the best, and the brightest in the company. If they need a finance person, they're going to go look for somebody who is the best and the brightest in finance. Unfortunately, oftentimes those people aren't available. They're very busy now. They're getting stretched because people know they're one of the best. Their manager knows we're one of the best, and they don't want to give up that particular resource. So it is up to the champion. We talked about a champion in previous chapters, but it's up to the champion to go out and really try to lobby for those types of people, the best people in that particular department, the best finance person, the best production person, the best customer service person in order to build that skill set. So with the champion going and talking to a particular boss or a particular manager of that particular team member, it's up to the project manager then to go out and talk to that team member directly and explain to them why it would be important for them to be on the team and contribute to the team. What's in it for them as well as what's in it for the organization, etc. So a project team leader has to be, or a project team manager has to be a little bit of a salesperson also to sell that particular resource on why it would be important for them to join the team, and not only why it would be particularly important for them, but also particularly important for the organization. The negotiation with the supervisor happens both at the champion level, and we talked about that, as well as at the project manager level. Sometimes there's a joint meeting. Sometimes it's just the champion doing it that's paving ways for it. Excuse me. Sometimes that has to be negotiated up, and sometimes we have to go to a higher order, maybe a VP or something like that, in order to secure some resources. And then again, you know, that's with we're negotiating with the top management. And then once we do that, we try to start setting up our team, developing our team, and getting our team to start acting as a team and coming together as a team member. The problem is oftentimes a project manager will want a particular person from, say, finance or from, say, production or customer service or accounting or something like that. And the person's very busy, and sometimes that person is stretched so much that it's the wrong fit. They just don't have time for the project team. So if that's the case, then this process might have to start over and over and over again until that project manager and that champion finds the right resources, the right team to come together. So effective project teams have a clear sense of mission. They understand why it's important. They understand why it's important for the organization. More importantly, and just as importantly, I don't know if I would say more importantly, but just as importantly, they need to understand the sense of mission and why it's important for themselves. What's in it for them? Is it going to help their career? Is it going to offer exposure to upper management? So people, yeah, they want to be good corporate citizens and they want to do what's right for the corporation, for the mission, for the division, etc. But they also, in the back of their mind, know that anything worth doing is worth doing for personal gain also. And personal gain, although might not be the topmost in their mind, but they also want to have something come out of it that is a personal benefit to them. And sometimes it's intrinsic. Sometimes it's just feeling good about what they've accomplished. Oftentimes, though, it's extrinsic, and they want to be exposed to upper management. They want to be exposed to other people within the organization, and they want really upper management to recognize that they've done a nice job. Effective project teams have productive interdependency. In other words, a finance person works with a customer service person who works with a marketing person. So they're interdependent. One person is handing off to the other, and the other one's picking it up, and then handing back to the other one. I mentioned in the introduction cohesiveness. Cohesiveness in teams is a key concept that we talk about in organizational behavior. Cohesiveness meaning the team is forming really and performing as one. They're cohesive, they're performing as one. They're in lockstep with one another. With cohesiveness comes trust and enthusiasm for the project. And generally speaking, when the project team starts, and we're going to talk about this in closing the project, but when the project team starts, there is a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of enthusiasm because people are looking towards getting the project done and contributing to the project team. As that project team starts moving forward and as things go by, there are periods of waning as well as waxing enthusiasm. Waxing enthusiasm because things are getting done, waning enthusiasm because they're hitting roadblocks or something like that. The key thing, though, and one of the things that the project leader has to bring forward and bring to fruition within their project team is the project team has to be results oriented. They all have to be working towards a goal, and that goal has to be very clear, and everybody needs to understand what is the end point. How can we stand up in front of management and everybody else and say we're done? That's one of the key things, is standing up and saying we're done. And when you do that, then everybody understands a clear mission. Again, that's the first thing I said on this slide, and they understand a clear purpose and a clear goal. Obviously, there's a ton of reasons why project teams would fail, but I can tell you one of the first and foremost is that the team doesn't perform as one. They do not have good cohesiveness. They don't have good interdependencies. No one understands their role. No one understands when their role starts and their role stops and the other person's role starts and stops. They can't work together. A finance person can't work with a marketing person, or if they can work with them, they don't understand what each one of them is supposed to do. There's very unclear expectations. There's lack of team motivation. They don't see the what's in it for me. Again, project teams aren't only self-motivated or motivated in self-gain, but there's got to be something there because they're going to spend a lot of time in this team, and they need to know that at the end of the rainbow, there is some of that gold for me too. Poor communication. Communication you're going to see and have seen so far throughout the semester, and we're about halfway through the semester now, but communication you're going to see throughout the semester is the key thing that a project manager can do. And when a project manager is not communicating effectively, well, things break down. That leadership characteristic is not there. The other thing is turnover. When someone can't dedicate the time to the team and you've got to continue to replace that team or team member or replace them with somebody else, then you've got to continually bring that person up to speed with what the team has done so far. And so that means a poor turnover, poor team member, and lack of cohesiveness. You know, one of the things that team members can have is that cohesiveness, and oftentimes it doesn't start right from the get-go. And we're going to talk about that in the stages of team development coming up in just a few minutes. But once we get through that storming stage and we start developing a cohesive team, consistent membership throughout that project management team is key in order to ensure cohesiveness. And then finally, dysfunctional behavior. That dysfunctional behavior is dysfunctional conflict. And we're going to talk about conflict in a team. But conflict, and I brought this up in Chapter 4 when we had the video lecture on Chapter 4. Conflict is healthy in a team. Conflict means that people are motivated. They're working. They're thinking. They have a stake in the game. They want something to fail. If there's no conflict within a team, if a team has absolutely no conflict, that means they've checked out. They don't care about the goals. They just want to come in. They want to put in their time. They'll sit there in the meetings. They'll nod. They'll say yes. They're not thinking about the project. They don't care about the project, etc. When you have conflict, that means someone cares. You know, if you have conflict and they're saying, no, I don't think that's right. I think we should do this. And the other person says, well, no, I think we should do that. That means they're thinking about the end goal. That's important to have in a team meeting. That's important to have in team membership. But dysfunctional conflict, when people are calling each other names and they're calling each other stupid and they're not listening, and they're talking over one another, and they're trying, after the meeting, they're trying to garner people to get to their side. They're actually storming again. Well, that's dysfunctional behavior. That's dysfunctional conflict. And that kills a project team. Functional conflict is important. Dysfunctional conflict, that's a whole nother matter. You know, you look at a debate team. Debating is extraordinarily important because each person takes a side. Each person has passion about that side, has passion about what they're bringing to the table. But when it breaks down, they stop listening to one another. They do their own thing anyways, regardless of what the team thinks. That is dysfunctional behavior. That's dysfunctional conflict. So, as I talked at the beginning, and as I talked in the beginning of the introduction, there are stages in group development: forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning. And all those are stages that teams go through. Every team goes through these. And moving from the storming to the norming phase is a key thing that a project manager can do, is moving their team members from the storming to the norming. And we're going to talk about each one, what happens in each phase in just a minute. Then we're going to talk about another model. It's called the punctuated equilibrium model. Both of these models are discussed extensively in organizational behavior, organizational psychology classes, etc. And when you think about organizational psychologists, they talk about these concepts. They're very familiar with these concepts because it's important to make sure that managers understand these concepts and managers can shepherd, if you will, or steer their team from the forming, norming, performing, and adjourning stage. So in forming, team members come together, they become acquainted. They start, they're very, very apprehensive about one another. And then you've got storming, that's where conflict begins. And oftentimes it's dysfunctional conflict. Norming is when they reach agreement, and then they start performing. And then eventually they adjourn. And again, all this is going to come up in the next slide. So in the team development stages, you see here the forming, the storming, the norming, and then the performing. And in each one of those, the key words there is to the right or down below. Let's talk about forming. The first one is inclusion. People in the forming stage are polite to one another. They're quiet, they're very guarded, they're impersonable, they're just meeting one another, they're introducing themselves, etc. They're very businesslike. They don't show their hand, they don't show their personality. Their personalities don't come through, etc. They're very guarded. They're trying to understand, who is going to be my ally, who's not going to be my ally, who can help me here, what am I doing here, all these types of things. Then they start storming. And that's when people start fighting for control. You start little cliques forming. People are starting to polarize from one another. People are joining forces. There's conflict over control. There's alienation. People are starting to form opinions of one another. This person is not going to be helpful. This person isn't very smart. This person isn't very productive, etc. At this point in time, there's heavy-duty, dysfunctional conflict. Now, not so much maybe in the project teams, but outside of the project teams, people are trying to liaison with one another, etc. There's alienation. There's personal agendas, etc. Very low morale. Then, from there, well, once the teams get out of storming, they get into norming. And that's when they start establishing procedures, they start developing team skills, they start understanding and reconfirming why they're in the team, etc. And then they're performing. And in that performing stage, they're moving forward, they're getting things done, they're walking in lockstep, they are moving forward to the goal. The key thing that any manager can do, project manager, is move from the storming stage into the norming stage. And to do that, they've got to have open communication. In order to do that, they've got to make sure that they see what's going on, not even only inside the meetings, but outside the meetings. They've got to try to break down those controls. They got to try to break down those personal agendas, and they got to remind the team why they're there. They have to remind the team what they're trying to do, and they've got to remind the team of roles and responsibilities. The key thing in the storming area that a project manager can do is establish key and strong roles and responsibilities. What each one's responsible for, the skill set they bring. They can go over each one and let each person even talk about the skill sets that they bring to the table around a round table. So they might call on the finance person and say, tell us about yourself. Tell us about some of your experiences. Tell us about where you think you can help this team, so that they're breaking down those barriers. They're breaking down that alienation, etc. Making sure that everybody understands why they're there, understands what particular skill sets they can bring, and what others people's skill sets are they can bring, will help move from that storming phase into the norming phase. Once you get in the norming phase, then performing usually comes right after that. So here's the punctuated equilibrium model. It's kind of builds off of the forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning stage. The first meeting, you can see that line there from the first meeting to the midpoint. That's that's coming together, forming, and storming. And then all of a sudden there's this eruption of personnel, and that eruption is actually an eruption of productivity. And then they go through some more, maybe a little bit of storming, and then more productivity. And throughout the whole punctuated equilibrium model, you'll see where people
are performing, and that's when the line's going up, and when they're going back to storming a little bit, and then when they're performing and they're going back to storming a little bit. So they kind of move in and out of those stages, but the longest stage for storming is that from the first meeting to really when they start being productive. Project managers need to understand when storming is happening, understand why storming is happening, and bringing their team back so that they're norming and performing again. So it's important for a project manager to understand the points of the punctuated equilibrium model and to manage through that. The best way they can do that, and we've talked about this oftentimes in the past, the best way they can do that is to foster communication, not only communicate with the team, but have a team communicate with one another. So achieving cross-functional cooperation, understanding the goals, the roles and procedures, and establishing good roles and procedures. And that's one of the key things that a project manager can do, is establish procedures, establish policies, establish roles, and establish what skill sets each one can bring. That'll help bringing people out of the storming and into the norming and performing area. Physical proximity. And that doesn't, it's funny because physical proximity can mean they don't have to be right next to each other, but physical proximity, you can bring in physical proximity through video conferencing and things like that. And also letting people know that how to get a hold of people, when to get a hold of people, what the best times are and best way to get a hold of people. So even though you're not physically in proximation, you can be virtually physically in proximation. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. And you can be physically proximate by having accessibility. So building high-performance work teams, one of the things is making the teams tangible, making the teams public to one another and public to the rest of the organization, making sure the rest of the organization knows why each member of the team is there and what they can bring to the party. And also establishing good terminology and good language, not only inside the team, but outside the team. Making sure that the language outside the team is cohesive towards one another. Making sure the language outside the team is complementary towards one another. Rewarding good behavior. Not only rewarding people after the end of the project, but rewarding them during the project. Again, project team members come and serve on the project team really for two reasons. One, to move the organization forward, and it's their job. They have to. But number two, there's got to be some personal gain in there. So rewarding good behavior throughout, making sure that people know how good people are doing, and their managers know that, so that they get some recognition, so that they get some rewards, so the next time they're sitting with their manager and they're going through their performance evaluation, they have good things come and said about from their project manager, is all important in building high performance work team. And then finally, developing a personal touch. You know, one of the things that is kind of key is having a project manager where the project team likes them. If the project team likes the project manager, they don't want to disappoint them. So that personal touch, bringing in some examples and leading by examples and giving positive feedback and making sure that people are consistent, etc. And actually having people like the project manager goes a long way in building those high performance work teams. I have worked on a variety and tons of virtual project teams where electronically we're bringing the teams together. Electronically, we are having our virtual team meetings, and that's through Skype, that's through other video conferencing, etc. When I worked for Xerox, and I think we've talked about this often, but when I worked for Xerox, my boss and part of my team was in the UK. Some of my team was in Georgia, and then some of my team was actually over in Paris. And we had virtual team meetings every week, talking about what was going on, reviewing action items, reviewing goals, etc. And it worked out very, very well, provided everybody actually participated in the virtual project team, and everybody was there, not only there physically, but there in spirit also. One of the difficulties was, as you know, France is 6 hours ahead. So oftentimes we would have project meetings very early in the morning here on the East Coast for those people in Georgia and for myself, and it was in the afternoon for them. So, sometimes there's some time differences that have to be taken in advance example. But the virtual teams can really be very, very productive if everybody comes into the virtual team and plays their part, does their role, etc. The other thing that was important is we got together at least twice. We got together when the team first started up. So we all got together down in Atlanta, Georgia. It just so happened that it was very cold up here. It was in the wintertime in Rochester, so we decided we'd get together in Atlanta, Georgia. So those people from the UK and from Paris all came to Atlanta. We'd had our first team meeting, a 2-day team meeting actually, in Atlanta, Georgia, where we established our roles and responsibilities. I was trying to get people from the storming stage back into the norming stage as quickly as possible. The other thing is I made sure that the project team communicated with me and communicated with one another, so nobody disappeared, nobody fell under the radar or fell through the cracks. Boy, that was tough for me to say. And everybody stayed in the communication loop. So we talked about conflict. Conflict management is probably one of the key things other than communication that project team leader can do. The first thing, though, I want to say is first thing the project team leader should do is they should spurn some healthy conflict. That way, the project team leader knows that everybody's engaged and everybody's trying and everybody's worked. And we talked about that earlier in this module. Conflict is a process that begins when someone perceives that they're frustrated or perceives that someone's not listening or perceives that they don't think their idea is a good one. So conflict can come from categories of goal-oriented, administration, or interpersonal conflict, or come from views, behavioral views, traditional views, international views, or actually some stereotype views. And the interpersonal and stereotypic views lead, generally speaking, to dysfunctional conflict. But goal-oriented views, behavioral views sometimes are very important when it comes to conflict. If someone has a particular way in which to reach a goal and they disagree with somebody else, that's healthy because that spurns on new ideas, it fosters new ideas, etc. So all those things are important when it comes to conflict management. So managing conflict, both on the productive conflict as well as the dysfunctional conflict, is an absolute key role that a project manager can do. So as we talked about on the last slide, some of the sources of conflict here can be both organizational and interpersonal. Organizational might be the reward systems, might be scarce resources. Someone thinks that they're working too hard. Now, these are sources of dysfunctional conflict. Uncertainty. They don't know what they're trying to do, so they become very, very inter-conflicted, and then they bring that conflict out to other members of the team. Also, differentiation or being different can be sources of conflict. And having different bosses, having different goals, etc., in their personal career. Interpersonal can be bad communication, personal grudges, stereotypes, prejudices, faulty attributions. All those types of things can be sources of conflict from a interpersonal aspect. Again, these are all sources of dysfunctional conflict. Functional conflict, generally speaking, the sources are disagreement amongst how one is going to reach a goal. And again, some of that is very healthy. Conflict resolution: mediate, arbitrate, control, accept, and eliminate. First of all, let's say accept. Some conflict, even dysfunctional conflict, is unmanageable. So people are just going to be that way. So you've got to sit down, you've got to talk with them and say, we're never going to solve this. We're never going to manage your differences. But let's put our differences aside until which time we can achieve our goal as a project team, and then we can break up and you guys don't have to deal with one another anymore. Mediate would be to diffuse the conflict. Arbitrate would be to make judgment, be an arbitrator. Oftentimes that is very difficult for a project manager because they don't want to have to take sides, but in some cases they do. And eliminate the conflict by transferring either resources out or more resources in. And again, as I said, dysfunctional conflict is bad. Functional conflict is often evidence of good progress. Negotiation, a process that is predicated on a manager's ability to use influence. The key thing with negotiation and project management is you got to understand how much power do you have. In a project team, remember, in most organizations in a project team, project managers, the project team does not directly report to a project manager. They dotted line report to them. So in some instances, the project manager has very, very little power. In some instances, however, if it's a very strong dotted line, and especially if it's a very visible project where the CEO and upper management are looking for it, they have more power because the dotted line responsibility is stronger. So when negotiation, a project manager oftentimes has to say, how much power do I have? In some cases, I have ultimate power and I can just say, you must do that. Now, that's not a good thing, but sometimes it is a thing. And the other thing that a project manager needs to understand is what type of time pressures are there. The closer the time pressure is, the more the negotiation has to be done more quickly, and the more power the project manager can influence. And then finally, there's got to be a level of trust in the negotiation. So principled negotiations, you separate the people from the problem and you look at the problem. That happens especially when there is dysfunctional conflict, and the dysfunctional conflict is from differentiation or stereotypes. Focus on the interest of not only the people, but also the interests of the organization. And think of mutual gain. How can we negotiate this conflict so that there's a win-win-win? Remember, everybody likes to play win-win-win. And when I say win-win-win, I mean win for the organization, win for the project team, and win for each one of the individuals that have the conflict. How can we turn this into a win-win-win so that everybody's happy? And oftentimes, enabling that or turning it into a win-win-win is the way you can negotiate through contracts, through conflicts, and you can negotiate a good end to whatever differentiation there is. And then finally, listening. Being a good listener and making sure you're listening to not only your side of the view, somebody else's side of the view, etc. So that's going to conclude our concepts in this. Again, very, very important when we talk about these concepts with team, conflict, negotiation, and the stages of team development. So over the next 2 slides is your summary slide. You can pause the video and read these summary slides and understand them. Make sure you understand them for when we get together on Monday when we talk. And until then, the next slide is going to give you your discussion questions. I look forward to you turning them in on Monday. And as we talked about, here's your aforementioned discussion questions. A couple of pages on those would be great. If you need to, please pause the video in order to take them down. And until then, I will see you all on Monday. Thank you, and have a great week.